Today, let us share the Word of God under the title, Things of the World are Done According to God's Word. Under this subject, let us take time to share God's grace. When we look at the prophecies of Daniel chapters 4 and 5, God let King Nebuchadnezzar know that God Himself is leading and operating all things of this world. In the book of Daniel, we can see the relationship between King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel several times. In Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar requested Daniel to interpret his dream. Let's see chapter 4, verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in my bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. In Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, but he couldn't remember what the dream was. There were people who always stayed near the king and gave him advice about government administration, magicians, enchanters, and diviners. In Daniel chapter 2, they said, "Tell us your dream, then we will interpret it for you." However, since the king didn't know what the dream was, they couldn't interpret it. In the end, he learned what his dream was through Daniel. Let's see chapter 4, verse 10. These are the visions I saw while lying in my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the beasts of the field found shelter, and the birds of the air lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in my bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger, a holy one coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, "Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone He wishes and sets over them the lowliest of men. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar." Here Daniel is called by his other name, Belteshazzar. "Tell me what it means." In chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar didn't even know what his dream was. But in chapter 4, he told them his dream, but people couldn't interpret it. Only Daniel interpreted the dream. Let's go to verse 19 and see his interpretation. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, "Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you." Belteshazzar answered, "My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries." The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the beasts of the field, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds of the air. You, O king, are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. You, O king, saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, "Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live like the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him." This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. King Nebuchadnezzar had thought that he had built the great kingdom of Babylon through his own power and authority. He had no idea that everything comes from God. God let him realize this through Daniel. Let's go to verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence? By my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Thinking about the glory of Babylon, its splendid buildings and culture, King Nebuchadnezzar thought, "All these have been built by my mighty power," and he was saying it with his lips. Verse 31. The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. King Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses when he realized that God is sovereign over all the kingdoms of men. He realized that the great empire of Babylon was not built by his own power, but that God let people be born around him and placed wise people, brave people, and generals with resourcefulness beside him, so that he could build that empire. When he finally realized that it was done not with his power, but by God, his sanity was restored. And he was able to regain the power of Babylon. This is what God teaches us in Daniel chapter 4. When we look at the things that are happening in the global village, it seems that certain presidents and prime ministers have good policies, or that certain people threaten the world. In fact, God is showing us signs about this age. Isn't He showing us through this phenomenon? Let's move on to chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. So he gave orders to bring in all the equipment used in the temple of God, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. The king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought and said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. Eventually, he had Daniel interpret the writing. Let's go to verse 16. "Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes." Daniel is enlightening King Belshazzar here. Verse 22. "But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Daniel chapter 5 shows that Babylon would be conquered by Media Persia in the time of King Belshazzar. Here too, Daniel pointed out, saying, "Why don't you know that God Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men? Didn't this already happen in the time of King Nebuchadnezzar? But why are you committing sin against God?" After he pointed this out, he interpreted the inscription that the hand wrote on the wall. "O king, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, and God has brought the days of your reign to an end." This was the interpretation of the inscription, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And in Daniel chapter 5, it is written that King Belshazzar was attacked by Media Persia, and that Babylon was destroyed that very night. People living on this earth must know God correctly and fear God, so that when they leave this world and return to the spiritual world, they will know who has guided them the whole time. Shouldn't we all learn this to know this fact and fear God correctly? This is why we must always pay attention to God's words and follow God's teachings. Let's go to Genesis chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, "I will wipe mankind, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, men and animals, and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 9. This is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, "I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth." Let's see verse 14. "So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out." It is God who operates this world. God let Noah know his will to punish the wicked with water. God let him know his will and told him that his job is to build an ark and make preparations for salvation. Noah didn't make any objection to this at all, but he carried out God's will. We can see this in chapter 6. Verse 22. Noah did what? Did everything just as God commanded him. Chapter 7, verse 4. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. And Noah did what? Did all that the Lord commanded him. The forefathers of faith fully understood that the whole world is governed by God. That's why they always obeyed God and followed God's words. They didn't reject God's commands or avoid them or turn away from them. Here too it says, Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. This way, God didn't destroy the whole world, but left some seeds behind in Noah's ark. There was a time when the world was judged with water. And God also let us know about this age that we are living in, didn't He? Let's take a look at 2 Peter chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 6. By these waters also, the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for what? For fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, it is written, God is going to punish the wicked with fire. Then this work will surely be fulfilled as God said. Let's move on to verse 10. God is showing the future of this world that is being operated by God. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? All these things are going to happen without fail. So what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming. That day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. But in keeping with His promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness. So then, dear friends, since you are looking forward to this, make every effort to be found, how? Spotless, blameless, and at peace with Him. God is operating this earth. So we must be ready to be saved on the last day when God judges with fire, by living even more holy and godly lives. We must be found spotless and blameless in God's eyes. Let's see Zephaniah chapter 1. Even if people of the world live wicked lives, we, heavenly people, must not be swayed by that wickedness, right? Rather, we must lead them to the correct path. Let's see chapter 1, verse 2. I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. Let's move to verse 14. The great day of the Lord is near, near and coming quickly. Listen, the cry on the day of the Lord will be bitter, the shouting of the warrior there. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. I will bring distress on the people, and they will walk like blind men, because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood will be poured out like dust, and their entrails like filth. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. In what? In the fire of His jealousy, the whole world will be consumed, for He will make a sudden end of all who live in the earth. The judgment with fire is explained repeatedly. While governing and operating this earth, What God wants most is the salvation of mankind. Just as God showed no other way to escape it in those days, God shows us the way to escape it in this age too. While operating this world, God told us to enter a certain place in haste. When this moment comes, and when we see these things happening around us, where is that place? We must enter Zion quickly. Keep the feasts, especially the Passover, and escape all disasters. Let's see Psalm chapter 91. Chapter 91, verse 1. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress. Let's go to verse 7. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will what? It will not come near you. God has taken special measures to keep disasters from coming near. We too must prepare everything that God tells us to prepare. If God tells us to enter Zion, we must enter Zion. And if God tells us to keep the Passover holy, we must keep the Passover holy. If God tells us to keep the Sabbath according to the law, then we must keep the law of the Sabbath. And if God tells us to preach the Word of God to people who don't know it, we must preach to them. We must prepare everything. We must do everything. And then, we just need to wait. It is written, no disaster will come near you. Then what is it that we must do so that no disaster will come near us? Let's take a quick look at Exodus chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 11. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste, it is the Lord's Passover. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. He promised to protect us so that no disaster will come near us when we keep the Passover in this age as well. This was a promise that God already made 3,500 years ago at the time of the Exodus. Today, in this age too, amazing grace and the work of salvation happen when we obey God's words. We must keep this in mind and make a beautiful journey of faith, looking forward to the day of God's coming by living holy and godly lives. Just as God prepared the ark in the time of Noah, God tells us to enter Zion. Let us confirm this in Jeremiah chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 5. Announce in Judah and proclaim in Jerusalem and say, sound the trumpet throughout the land. Cry aloud and say, gather together. Let us flee to the fortified cities. Where is this place? It is Zion. Raise the signal to go to Zion. Flee for safety without delay. For I am bringing disaster from the north, even terrible destruction. A lion has come out of his lair, a destroyer of nations, a destroyer of all the countries that exist on this earth, has set out. He has left his place to lay waste your land. Your towns will lie in ruins without inhabitant. Where do we need to go at this time? To Zion. We, God's people, don't need to be anxious wherever we are, because God is always with us. Let us not fail to always give thanks to God for calling us for such a great work, making us His children, and allowing us to work as part of the work of salvation. Since we've been called for this work, I'd like to ask all the children of Zion to always live holy and godly lives and obey everything that God commands us and follow in the footsteps of father and mother. Thank you very much.